Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be revisiting History of Political Philosophy, 3rd edition, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. I have looked at this book the past several episodes. This was the 3rd in a series. I've got a few more episodes that are going to come back to this book. This book was originally published in 1963. This 3rd edition is from 1987. It's essentially a collection of essays about various political thinkers. There are, I believe, 39 essays in here, and there are a wide variety of authors, each one writing about a different political philosopher through the ages. Starts way back with Thucydides and carries it right up into the 20th century. I've done a couple episodes, and I've got this one and a couple more, and I'm really focusing on some thinkers from the Enlightenment era. I probably will come back to this book at some point in the future and maybe look at some other of the essays. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. For now, though, we'll stick with some Enlightenment thinkers. This episode, I'm going to talk about Montesquieu, and this Montesquieu essay is by David Lowenthal. And Montesquieu is probably one of the lesser known of the Enlightenment philosophers. I am a fan, I think, based on what I'm seeing here. I didn't really know much about Montesquieu before reading this essay. I haven't read any of his actual writings. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, I don't know, but this is a pretty interesting discussion of Montesquieu. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections of this essay and have a little bit of commentary on some of them. I think I have 7 sections here to read. Montesquieu is not really known as a social contract theorist like the others that I have been discussing. He does talk a little bit about human nature and the laws of nature. It's a very common subject at the time. What are the laws of nature? What is the state of nature? He talks about that a little bit. But it's a little bit more like Aristotle, actually, where he looks at different systems of government and kind of analyzes them. What are the good points? What are the bad points of democracy or aristocracy or monarchy? Those are the main 3 throughout the ages that people have looked at and analyzed, and he follows along those lines. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to jump in and start reading here a little bit about Montesquieu and see what we can take out of this. I like Montesquieu. He talks about, he's sort of a materialist, I think. I'm not sure what his, I don't really know what his religious disposition is. He talks in here a little bit about religion, not an awful lot. Religion is not a major part of Montesquieu's thought. So let's jump in and read a little bit of this. He talks about, he begins talking about the laws and the nature of man and what law is. So he says, quote, "In his famous opening formulation, Montesquieu defines laws, in the most extensive sense, as the necessary relations deriving from the nature of things. Laws are relations. They exist objectively and by necessity. They govern the action of all things, of God on the world, of bodies on each other, and so on. This universal lawfulness is the background against which human law must be viewed. But the term law is equivocal. In human enactments, it implies a lawmaker, a promulgation of the law to those who are to obey it, and law enforcement with attendant sanctions. Then, do laws govern all things in the universe, exactly as they may govern human beings? The classic exposition for the affirmative had been St. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of law in the Summa Theologica. Human enactment, or positive law, was understood in terms of its connection with eternal law, natural law, and revealed law. Law as such was an ordinance of reason, made, promulgated, and enforced for the common good by the community's ruler, its ultimate source was the mind of God. Montesquieu's opening definition of law takes issue with the Thomistic tradition, first by appearing to leave no room for the miraculous, and second by depicting the universality of sheer, blind necessity, rather than governance rationally aimed at good. Human law, as human reason applied to man's governance, seems curiously out of place in such a world. But it is precisely the extent to which human affairs are swayed by mechanical causes that Montesquieu undertakes to demonstrate. By abandoning both divine and natural teleology, and indicating the limits of purposive human action as well, he hopes to establish a science of human affairs, consistent with Cartesian and Newtonian physics. It is difficult to say with assurance what view of God he considered compatible with this view of law and nature. Before there were human laws, there was man. To comprehend the diversity of human laws, we must visualize them emerging from man's nature, as he acts within particular natural and social settings. The variety of actual settings will account for the variety of human affairs, and indeed for the histories of all nations, provided we know the general principles involved, and provided due allowance is made for exceptional individuals, for political skill, and for chance. Human science requires historical studies, and these studies form the link between theory and practice. Political practice, or statesmanship, demands that each society be understood and treated in its particularity, in other words, in the light of its history. But historical particulars are intelligible only in the light of general causes, proximate and ultimate, and therefore sound historical knowledge requires theory or philosophy. This is how law as legislation and law as necessary relations among things are connected. End quote. Okay, so what do we have here? He's talking about law, and in the very end there, he mentions two different types of law. In the very last sentence, he says law as legislation and law as necessary relations among things. And those are connected. And the way that they're connected is that law springs forward from man's nature. The previous sentence, he says, to comprehend the diversity of human laws, we must visualize them emerging from man's nature as he acts within particular natural and social settings. So there are laws of human nature, but people exist in different scenarios, different settings, different circumstances. And those laws of human nature will manifest themselves in legislative law differently depending on the circumstances. And so for that reason, he says, for the histories of all nations, the variety of actual settings will account for the variety of human affairs, and indeed for the histories of all nations, provided we know the general principles involved. So once you know the basic principles of human nature, and you know the various settings and circumstances, you can infer the way that laws will come about, or you can at least explain how the varieties of laws came about, even if you can't completely explain how which particular aspect of human nature and which particular setting manifests in this legal system or that legal system. To some extent, that's what we would like to be able to uncover, but he also says due allowance must be made for exceptional individuals, for political skill, and for chance. So there are enough variables here that can't be necessarily predicted, that it's not entirely possible to draw those conclusions. This particular law of human nature manifested in this particular scenario will yield this legislative action, because you have to account for chance, remarkable, exceptional individuals, leaders, political skill, a whole variety of circumstances that have to be accounted for. But when he's talking about law, in the very beginning, he says, in his famous opening formulation, Montesquieu defines laws in the most extensive sense as the necessary relations deriving from the nature of things. So you're really talking about the nature of reality and the necessary relations among entities within reality. In other words, the structure of reality, how this factor of nature and that factor of nature by necessity interact with one another according to their individual structures. And so we are bringing necessity in here and putting it as a centerpiece. And he does say that Montesquieu's opening definition of law takes issue with the Thomistic tradition, which he talks about briefly as law aiming toward the good, and the ultimate source of law, rationally derived law aiming at the good, is the influence of God on man. But Montesquieu's opening definition of law takes issue with this Thomistic tradition. First, by appearing to leave no room for the miraculous, and second, by depicting the universality of sheer blind necessity, rather than governance rationally aimed at good. So, its necessity becomes an important part that given the factors X, Y, and Z of human nature, of circumstance, of great leaders, of the individuals and their particular necessary qualities, law forms according to a system. And it is, at least in theory, predictable. So the whole thing becomes kind of materialistic, deterministic, and necessity takes a central role rather than God taking a central role in the construction of law among human societies. So there's an interesting sort of secularity to Montesquieu's political theory. Going on, there's also a sort of relativism in some of his ideas, which I will discuss now, where he says, quote, Montesquieu explicitly denies that any particular form of government or set of laws is required by, or most in accord with, nature. Law, in general, is human reason insofar as it governs all the peoples of the earth, and the political and civil laws of each nation ought only to be the particular cases in which this human reason is applied. The laws of each nation must be related to its form of government, its physical circumstances, for example, climate and geography, and social conditions, for example, liberty, mores, commerce, religion. And all the relations laws have, or ought to have, taken together, constitute their spirit. By this passage, the classical quest for the best state, Thomistic natural law, and Lockean natural right are all rejected as guides to the ordering of political society. Stark relativism emerges as the conclusion of Montesquieu's introductory book. But it is not subjectivism. Montesquieu grants that a certain set of laws may be, not merely be thought to be, objectively better or worse for a given people. He maintains, however, that there is an ultimately irreducible variety of norms, as well as of actual political configurations. These norms, in short, are not themselves capable of being judged in terms of what is absolutely best or worst politically. It would follow that the study of history is more important to the discovery of specific norms than the study of philosophy. Yet history, as the study of facts and causes, cannot by itself yield any norms whatsoever. How then are valid specific norms derived? End quote. So he'll go on to talk a little bit about valid specific norms, but essentially this is the idea that there's not necessarily any simple best way of governing, that each people in their own particular circumstances, their own particular natures, their cultures, and so on and so forth, may have a best political system for them. And another people in a different circumstance with a different history, different religion, different qualities of their culture, a different set of laws, a different set of political institutions may be best for that people. And this runs very counter to the idea that's promoted by both neoliberals and neoconservatives about the importance of sort of imposing democracy on the world, or imposing an American political system on the world, and that other political systems are the strong man or the theocracy or whatever we want to criticize about the way some other country does things, this communist tyranny of China or so on and so forth, we can't necessarily look to other countries and other cultures and say, oh, they should be doing what we're doing, because it may be that the way that they're doing things is best for them, and the way that we're doing things is better for us. So in that sense, there's sort of relativism, and it's not so easy to just say, here is the best system. But he does examine a couple of different systems, like I said, democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, and he looks at these and compares and contrasts them and kind of looks at what's good about them. And so it's not completely and totally, like he says, it's not totally subjective. It may be that some are better for some people and others are better for other people. It's not that, whatever you believe is whatever works, or whatever you think is best. There's no yardstick. There's no way to measure one thing against another. There is, but it's not necessarily the same for everybody. So, moving on from there to where he talks about democracy. He says, quote, Montesquieu does much more than merely supply information about the various forms of government as they have actually existed. He tells us that his chief objective is to construct the laws, institutions, and practices whereby each form is perfected. This by itself may be consistent with the relativism he purports to espouse, but he also compares the various forms with each other, in such a manner as to point toward their ultimate comparative merit. Is this possible without some absolute standard of political good and evil? Let us begin with the democratic republic. In a properly constituted democracy, the sovereign people will delegate authority to do what they themselves cannot do. They need to be guided in foreign affairs and the preparation of legislation by a council or senate, and can have confidence in it only if they choose it. They need magistrates, but are admirable at discerning the worth of individuals for this purpose. Legislation itself, however, will be by the people directly. Democracy does not require that all citizens be eligible for public office, but that all participate in the selection of the officers. Senators and lower civil magistrates are to be chosen by lot, not vote, and from among volunteers drawn from those who are not needy. The poor are not eligible. Military and high civil magistrates are to be elected by all, again from among those who are better off. Members of the popular courts, finally, are chosen by lot from among all volunteers, rich or poor. Thus, democracy is not the simple rule of the majority, nor simple rule by lot. It is a mixture. Indeed, the poor are obviously less privileged, and the well-to-do more so, than sheer numbers would admit, a fact strengthened by the implication that public offices would be left unsalaried and attendance at popular assemblies uncompelled. Democracy needs the conservatism as well as the self-support and leisure of the well-to-do, but it also needs merit, the procuring of which is aided by the use of techniques of election and examination of candidates. The principle of democracy is virtue, where all participate in making laws which they must themselves obey, and in choosing their own rulers from among themselves. A very high degree of public spiritedness, or devotion to the common good, is needed. Virtue, in short, is patriotism, love of the republic and the laws, and from it stem the particular citizen virtues of probity, temperance, courage, and patriotic ambition. To preserve virtue, the extremes of wealth and poverty must be avoided, by setting legal minima as well as maxima to the possession of property. Virtue needs near equality, and more than that, a relatively low general level of wealth, assuring frugality and precluding luxury. This condition must both exist and be loved. Other methods of sustaining virtue are a censorial senate of elders, elected for life, to preserve the purity of mores, strong paternal powers, sumptuary laws, the public accusation of unfaithful wives, and in general, the mutual surveillance of all in points of conduct. Democracy can subsist only in a small city-state, the family-like cohesion of which engenders a continual preference for public over private good. Its public assemblies are not representative, but it is inconsistent with an independent clergy, i.e. a state within a state, and probably only consistent with pagan religion and morality. Solon's Athens, Sparta, Carthage, the later Roman Republic, are all adduced in illustration of democracy. No Christian, nor for that matter non-pagan or non-ancient commonwealth, is so named. Democracy's most attractive feature is the moral greatness of its citizens. Democracy also assures its citizens a high degree of freedom and security under law. On the other hand, it must, perforce, set limits both to their greatness and freedom. Its poverty, its smallness, its restriction of privacy, its reliance on unquestioning public devotion, and the mutual surveillance of its citizens prevent the more complete development of human talents, especially in the area of philosophy and the fine arts. Democracy means intellectual and artistic mediocrity. Montesquieu acknowledges a distinction between productive, commercial republics like Athens and military republics like Sparta. The first choice for democracy seems to be something between the two. The citizen body should consist of farmers who both work and fight. Nevertheless, a democracy based on the commercial spirit as its principle is possible, provided its laws keep this economical temper from being destroyed by excessive wealth. Montesquieu gives the impression, however, that the health of a commercial democracy is very difficult to sustain. The brilliance of Periclean, as distinguished from Solonian democracy in Athens, was predicated upon extremes of wealth, moral corruption, and freedom, i.e. on political decadence rather than health. End quote. Okay, so you've got some basics of Montesquieu's vision of democracy, and he's got a few ideas about how democracy should operate. In other words, this particular aspect should be determined by lot, in other words, by random selection. He says that the main thing that should be determined by lot, regardless of wealth, would be members of the popular courts. And this is sort of like a origin of the idea of jury duty, that you're judged by a jury of your peers, so the popular courts is selected randomly from all the people without regard to their wealth. That's where the popular courts would be selected from. Then you've got other areas where certain people are ineligible. He says senators and lower civil magistrates are to be chosen by lot, not vote, from among volunteers drawn from those who are not needy. So the poor are not eligible, but among well-to-do, upper middle class, or whatever the boundaries may be, put themselves forward as volunteers, and then who will serve the role from among those particular people would be determined by random selection. Then there are other things such as military and high civil magistrates. Now here you have areas where a certain degree of technical skill is more necessary, and so these are not selected randomly. These, like, you don't want your generals determined by random selection. You want them to be competent, experienced military officers. So here you have the public electing. So the military and the high civil magistrates would be elected by all, but from among those who are better off. So you've got a few different arrangements here, and it's kind of a blending of random selection and voting. We don't do an awful lot of random selection in our democracies. I don't think most people find it really necessary or fruitful for people to be selected at random to from among a variety of volunteers to manage things. More often than not, there's just no reason why we should feel that's such a valuable tool. We use it in jury duty, randomly selecting people to serve on juries. And even that has to go through a sort of vetting process of its own. Modern America, at least, we don't really find much value in that, and I can see why. I'm not sure that's really so spectacular, but he says that the principle of democracy is virtue. So essentially, this is self-government. There's nobody telling you how you should be, who you should be, what you should do. The people as a whole are managing their own government, and so a certain degree of virtue in the people is necessary. People have to be oriented toward the public good. They have to be prioritizing this strength of the society. If people are voting in their own self-interest, and you all only have these competing factions of groups of people, each of whom is voting and advocating and pushing their particular interests of their faction within the democracy, then in that case, democracy begins to break down. It only works, and that's why he says it requires small entities, small city-states. He talks about Athens and Sparta, these small areas where there's some degree of homogeneity, there's more tendency to feel a sense of loyalty because you're not necessarily sharing your votes with people who are hundreds of miles away that you've never seen, you don't know anything about, you might not even like them, but you're sharing a country with them, and you're all voting and fighting over access to power. Democracy works in city-states. It works in small areas where you can see the people who are making the decisions, and you can speak to the people who are making the decisions. You are an active part in the democratic process. And this requires a virtuous people. And democracy works with virtuous people. And democracy is not as effective with the people who are not as virtuous. So it demands virtue from people. But he also says it also demands a sort of mutual surveillance. Everybody kind of keeping an eye on everybody else. So let's jump forward to aristocracy. When he talks about aristocracy, he says the following. Quote, "The aristocratic republic is a regime wherein only a part of the people is sovereign, as best exemplified in the early Roman Republic and modern Venice. Aristocracy depends upon political and economic inequality between the sovereign nobles and the non-participating people. That the nobles should identify their own interest with the interest of the people, in this way most closely approximating the virtue of democracy, is rare, but not impossible. The more probable principle of aristocracy, however, is a spirit of moderation in the nobles, restraining them from seeking inordinate superiority over each other or the people. The laws and institutions conducive to such restraint are difficult to secure. In general, the larger the number of nobles and the smaller and poorer the body of those without political rights, the healthier the aristocracy. Democracy can therefore be considered the perfection of aristocracy. It is characterized by a broader concern and provision for the common good than aristocracy. Its members are, on the average, more virtuous, freer, and more secure. Or, from the other side, less humiliated and exploited." We should note that Montesquieu radically alters the standards and names used in the traditional Aristotelian classification of regimes. Aristotle classified in terms of the holders of sovereign authority and the purpose of their rule. Good regimes are ruled for the common good, bad ones for the advantage of the rulers themselves. Thus, a clear distinction is made between oligarchy and aristocracy, both being ruled by the few. Montesquieu has only 2, not 4, types of republic, depending on whether the whole or part of the people rules. Each type is perfected in a certain way, and actual instances of either would bear greater or less resemblance to this perfection. But, as in Machiavelli, the clear-cut distinction between virtuously and viciously motivated regimes is no longer primary. Thus, Montesquieu uses the term aristocracy for regimes that Aristotle would have called oligarchies. He also calls democracy the regime that Aristotle would probably have called polity, and even instances as democracies, regimes that Aristotle considered mixed aristocracies, for example, Carthage. One might conclude that Montesquieu's revised classification has 2 effects. First, it casts doubt on the adequacy of classifying regimes according to the goodness of their rulers' motives. Second, it elevates the worth of popular regimes, or of the popular element in mixed regimes, thereby teaching that the common good is best achieved through widespread popular participation in government. We might be led to question this by Montesquieu's high praise of the singular institutions of Plato's Republic in Book 4, but the consequence of this concession is not an adherence to the classical preference for aristocracy. Republican government has its natural place in a small society, and the expansion in the size, power, and wealth of a republic leads necessarily to the breakdown of its spirit and institutions. This is the lesson Montesquieu drew above all from his study of Rome, in opposition to Machiavelli's favoring of Roman imperialism in the Discourses. But the smallness required by republics poses a crucial problem of defense. The solution to this problem on a republican basis is the confederation, whereby several republics gather together to form a larger defensive whole. The modern Dutch Republic and the ancient Lycian Confederation are illustrations of this device. Montesquieu seems to have regarded confederation as an association of societies, not directly of individuals, and refers to the possibility of the confederations dissolving while its component societies remained. But he also explicitly favors, as in the Lycian case, a highly centralized rather than loose association of the member states. End quote. Okay, so he kind of goes off on a bunch of tangents here. He talks about how Aristotle made this distinction between your main three: democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, and then each one has one that's directed to the public good versus directed to the interests of the ruling class. So you've got monarchy and tyranny, and then you've got aristocracy and oligarchy, and then you've got polity and ochlocracy, mob rule, as the various types of democracy. So really ending with 6, and Montesquieu doesn't really follow that. Montesquieu doesn't make an awful lot out of the intentions of the rulers. That some systems would have, the rulers would have good intentions for the public good, and other systems they wouldn't. Montesquieu puts that sort of in the background, and understandably, we can't necessarily and always infer what the ruling class's motives are, and there's, I think, invariably going to be a sort of mixture of people who are acting in the public interest and people who are acting in self-interest, and even among a certain individual, there's going to be some tendency toward the public good and some tendency toward private interest. I think it's probably maybe with monarchy is most clearly, because you've got it boiled down to one person. But even so, the same exact system, the next generation with a new king, could go from a benevolent monarchy to a tyranny and back and forth again. If you're just looking at the intentions of the rulers and not the structure of the Constitution, then it's really just dependent on who, which particular set of people are in charge, more so than any actual difference in the system of government. And he also talks about confederations, because he continues to speak of, he's talking about a republic, an aristocratic republic, and it maintains the sort of need for smallness. And so the problem of defense comes up, how these small republics are able to defend themselves, and he advocates for a confederation, but it's a confederation in which the individual societies maintain their, large degrees of their sovereignty. It seems almost like a treaty of mutual defense type of affair, where they are really only confederating in order to solve the problem of defense that a small republic has, the ability to defend itself militarily. But Montesquieu doesn't seem like a very big fan of aristocracy. He says it's much more difficult to create a set of laws that prevent the ruling class from acting in their own best interest. It's difficult to find aristocrats, elites, who are going to rule for the benefit of the public good, as opposed to the benefit of themselves individually or the benefit of their class, which they will benefit from. And this is part of the benefit of democracy, is that even though everybody's looking out in some sense for himself, in a properly functioning democracy, the acting in his own self-interest and acting in the interest of the public good are in some ways synonymous. Now, the more it breaks down into factionalism, the more that equation of the public interest and the private interest being the same or very similar, that starts to fade away and it becomes the interests of the factions. And then he talks about monarchy. And let's jump into that section here. He says, quote, "In monarchy, one person governs according to fixed and established laws. This requires that there be powers, intermediate, between the monarch and the people, hence the nobility, church, and cities. There must also be an independent depository or guardian of the laws, such as the French parliaments. Together, these forces, by their privileges and independence, are able to restrain the actions of both the monarch and the people. Nevertheless, when the monarch combines the legislative and executive power in his own person, as in France, the government inclines toward despotism. Cautiously, though clearly, Montesquieu gives evidence of regarding a balanced monarchy as one in which something like the old French Estates General shared legislative power with the monarch. Unless monarchy has such a structure as this, it is not a stable regime. Montesquieu claimed that the ancient world had no proper conception of monarchy. This conception arose out of the Germanic conquest of Rome, its two main components being an independent, hereditary, privileged nobility and representative government. The closest the ancients came to it was the monarchy of the heroic age described by Aristotle. But there the people had direct legislative power and were able ultimately to strip the king of his powers. Regarding the classification of monarchies, Montesquieu explicitly takes issue with Aristotle. He rejects the classical principle of classifying regimes on the basis of the intentions or virtues and vices of the rulers. To have a good monarchy, it is not enough to have a good monarch. Government has a nature or constitution only if its structure does not depend on so unreliable a circumstance as an important individual's nature or nurtured moral endowment. Nevertheless, Montesquieu himself admits later that the moral character of a monarch is as vital to the liberty of his country as are its laws. The principle of monarchy is honor, not virtue. Montesquieu is very severe in his moral criticism of the courts and principal men of monarchies everywhere. He speaks of their miserable character and of their trumpery spreading to all levels of society. Yet the object most sought in monarchies, honor, or superiority of condition and person, serves as a substitute for the incentives of virtuous action. Ambition for distinction, on the part of all classes and individuals, elicits conduct that redounds to the public benefit, while aiming only at private or selfish good. In addition, the code of honor sets unofficial limits to the arbitrariness of king and subject alike. The honor-seeking, criticized by Montesquieu, cannot simply be identified with the activity attributed by Aristotle to the magnanimous or proud man. Monarchy's system of mores and manners is vulgarized honor, or honor that seeks to be recognized by many, that depends much more on recognition by others, that succumbs to, rather than resists, the vices, for example gallantry, that are popularly taken for signs of boldness. On the other hand, Montesquieu seems less willing than Aristotle to accept the mental horizon of the magnanimous man himself, insofar as that horizon is bounded mainly by self-esteem, and encourages action less out of love of the public good than out of self-esteem and the desire for the highest honors. The laws supporting honor in monarchies must grant hereditary privileges to the persons and property of the nobility. Luxury should be permitted as a means of supporting the poor, and commerce on the part of non-nobles favored. Monarchy is more inherently set on ambitious war and conquest than is the republic, and naturally requires a larger territory. But immoderate expansion weakens the power of honor and encourages despotic power. In general, monarchy is less moral, less just, less stable than democracy. It must guarantee vast hereditary inequalities. Nevertheless, it is compatible with and even requires a structure of written and unwritten law that protects person and property in their very inequality. End quote. So he doesn't seem to be much of a fan of monarchy. He does say that monarchy requires a larger territory, and it tends toward a larger territory because it's more likely to engage in war and conquest. And he says that the principle of monarchy is honor. He says Montesquieu is very severe in his moral criticism of courts and principal men of monarchies everywhere. He says that honor sort of acts as a substitute for virtue. People engaging in what could be considered virtuous behavior, but for the purpose of seeking honor for themselves. I think that all of these have some components of value to them. I'm personally a fan of a mixed system. Democracy alone has some flaws that he doesn't even talk about. Some of the flaws of the tendency toward. He does talk about a sort of tendency toward mediocrity, and democracy really is the rule of the average, and the rule of the mediocre. And it does have its tendency to break up into factionalism, whereas there's a sort of stability in aristocracy. When you've got a hereditary aristocracy, the same people have power over time, and you might get factions of nobles against one another, factions of elites against one another. You might have the elites against the common people. It's not a total end of factionalism, but when you can sort of temper the excesses of the various systems with the power of the other systems, ideally you can come up with something that hopefully takes a bit of the benefits of the various systems while toning down some of the problems with the various systems. Maybe easier said than done, but it seems like that's probably the best outcome, it seems to me. And even when he talks about monarchy, he says, well, the monarch must be restricted. He must rule according to some set of laws. Here's what the king can do. Here's what the king can't do. And in order for there to be any sort of restraint on the king's power, there has to be other institutions. And he mentions the church, the nobility, the cities, the people, and these sort of intermediary institutions to restrain the monarchy is exactly what I'm talking about. They constrain the monarchy in the same way that a monarch and an aristocracy could constrain democracy, and so on and so forth. The sort of checks and powers of the various components of society and the various components of an integrated system. So going on from there, he talks a bit about liberty, and he ties it to England. He talks about England a lot as being sort of the model state when it comes to advancing the liberty of a people. He says, quote, "Political liberty in its relation to the Constitution requires not only that the three powers be separated, but that they be constituted in a certain way. The judicial power should be given to ad hoc juries, composed of the defendant's peers, with judgments being determined as precisely as possible by written law. The legislative power must be divided. Its main part should go to the duly elected representatives of the whole people, and only those in so base a condition that they are thought to have no will of their own should lack voting rights. Those distinguished by birth, riches, or honors ought to comprise a body of nobles, who protect their hereditary privileges by serving as the second half of the legislature. The executive should be a monarch, whose check on the legislature would consist of a veto power, and whose ministers, in turn, could be examined and punished by the legislature, though he himself could not legally be removed." Montesquieu regards the England so described as not only freer but more just, and in some respects wiser than the ancient republics or his own democracy. Its first advantage is the clear-cut separation of powers and the checking mechanism built into the legislative and executive branches. The second is the representation of public opinion through one branch of the legislature, which can then proceed to discuss legislative matters and abstain from executive decisions in a manner impossible to the ancient city-state. In addition, the judicial power is less menacing and more just. Finally, the single executive, though not comparable in wisdom to a body like the Roman Senate, will nevertheless possess a great amount of concentrated power and sufficient motives to wield that power vigorously. Constitutional government of this type could not be expected to work without a considerable amount of internal friction, so that some sacrifice of quality and smoothness in governmental operation is the necessary cost of liberty. Montesquieu makes the ambiguous claim that such liberty is established in the laws of England, whether or not this liberty is actually enjoyed by the English people. Nevertheless, he clearly adheres to the logic of liberty as he understands it, rather than to the actualities of mid-18th century England. If he did not draw attention to the very limited and irregular suffrage of the people, and very irregular distribution of seats in the House of Commons, it was undoubtedly because he thought those actualities deficient from the viewpoint of liberty. Similarly, if he refused to describe those tendencies toward the merging of executive and legislative powers that later became known as cabinet government, it may well have been because he thought they were harmful to liberty. The main advantage of England over that freest of ancient commonwealths, the Roman Republic, is its having weakened the direct and massive power of the people, and granted both nobles and commoners an almost impregnable, mutually limiting authority. But the main distinctions between what liberty meant to England and what it meant to ancient republics are still to be seen. For it is not enough to have a proper constitution. Proper laws are also necessary if the citizen is to enjoy the maximum in legal security. Here the criminal laws are crucial, having a function similar to that of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution of the United States. Montesquieu distinguishes 4 kinds of crimes: those against religion, against morals, against tranquility, and against security. The net result of his analysis is to make it impossible in a free state to prosecute sacrilege by legal means, or to punish moral turpitude except in sexual matters. Limitations are also set to the dangerous charge of treason, and writings should be considered criminal only when they prepare treasonable action. Finally, legal procedures and penalties must be so devised as to ensure just treatment as far as possible. Now the distance separating the republic founded on virtue and modern England begins to appear in its true dimensions. They have a basic resemblance. Both are republics, a fact that England's monarchical past tends to obscure. They illustrate Montesquieu's judgment that the best of governments will have a massive popular foundation, which will guarantee its concern for the common good. But England embodies individualism, each citizen being left alone to live as he pleases. Religion is a private concern of the individual, so also is the choice of his way of life. Philosophic inquiry has the privacy it needs. The arts and sciences have freedom of expression. England departs from the conformity, rigor, and inquisitiveness of democratic virtue. Far from being a requirement of modern England, virtue is even dangerous to it." End quote. Okay, so what have we here? He talks about England, and he talks about political liberty, and he talks about the mixed regime. Now, England has a monarch, and it has a House of Lords, and it has a House of Commons. He's talking about a broad base in one, he says, a divided legislature, a lower house and an upper house, which is what England has, and we in the United States have a sort of version of that with the House of Representatives and the Senate. But he says the legislative power must be divided. Its main part should go to the duly elected representatives of the whole people, and only those in so base a condition that they are thought to have no will of their own should lack voting rights. So he's talking about broad suffrage. Many people should be able to vote. Everybody should be able to vote unless they are legally incompetent to a point where they have no will of their own. Children, let's say, people who are deeply mentally impaired, perhaps. But essentially, voting should be as broad as possible for this one half of the legislative body. But, he says, those distinguished by birth, riches, or honors ought to comprise a body of nobles who protect their hereditary privileges by serving as the second half of the legislature. Now, could you really have a second half of the legislature that is comprised of all of the people who are distinguished by wealth or birth or whatever, the people who one would qualify as the elite, and however you wish to define that. It seems to me, especially in a large country like the United States, or any country now in the modern world has an awful lot of people in it, even England, would be that have to be sort of two tiers of voters, that you've got a wide suffrage given to the people to vote into the people's house, the lower house, the House of Commons, the House of Representatives, and then you could have a separate class of voter who is the elite, who is the nobility, the landed aristocracy, the people who own land, the people who have a certain amount of wealth, the people perhaps who have some hereditary ties to the early founders of the nation, deep blood roots and resources, who would have a higher tier of voting power. And those people would be the people who would vote in the members of the upper house. And so the upper house would be representative not of the people as a whole, but would be representative of the landed aristocracy. Then he talks about a monarch or an executive, and he still cites England. England obviously has a monarch. The modern king of England doesn't have an awful lot of power, and what power he does have, he just doesn't tend to use, because tradition seems to indicate in England, at least in the present era, that the king does nothing and has no real role. I think there's a problem there. England, like everyone else, has given itself over so much to democracy that the House of Commons runs the country, and the House of Lords doesn't have an awful lot of power, and the king doesn't have an awful lot of power. Seems to me, anyway. I'm not an expert on England. But, some of the problems of England and of the West in general can be traced back to the fact that the nobility has been completely stripped of all of its power. There is no landed aristocracy, there is no hereditary aristocracy, and that lack of power just gives it the same problems that the United States of America has. So, but he talks about this as being like the way of acquiring liberty, because these different factions, these different components of the government acting as a check on one another, he says, the main advantage of England over the freest of ancient commonwealths, the Roman Republic, is its having weakened the direct and massive power of the people, and granted both nobles and commoners an almost impregnable, mutually limiting authority. So you've got the commoners and the nobles, each have power, neither can remove the other from power, each acts in its own interests, and therefore each checks and restrains the authority of the other. Now, with multiple factions in government all restraining the authority of one another, you wind up with a fairly restrained government on the whole. And that deliberate restraining of the power of government through these competing factions creates conditions in which liberty, individual liberty, can thrive. That's the premise. Obviously, liberty is not the only value a society should hold. A society isn't built in its entirety simply for the purpose of providing maximum liberty to the people. It's one of its functions, but it's not the only function. But this competing system does provide liberty as well as provide other things such as continuity and somewhat of a restriction on factionalism. There's obviously still factions, but you kind of have the position and the power of the factions set in stone to some extent through the constitutional system, rather than one side of the faction can vote itself a bunch of money, and then the other side of the faction angrily gains control and then votes themselves a bunch of resources and a bunch of power and authority. But it's all always contingent as to which faction is in power at any given moment. And you have this seesaw effect where even like the president being voted by the people, president of one party gets into power and enacts a bunch of policies. and then the president of the other party gets into power and negates all of the policies of the previous president and enacts a bunch of new opposing policies. And then the other team gets control, and all the policies go back to the first form. And there's no consistency because the whole system is determined by which faction is in power at any given moment, rather than a constituted delineation of this faction's power is here, this faction's power is here. And it doesn't change by who gets in power from the common vote from one election cycle to the next. It's enshrined in the Constitution who has what power. That creates consistency, creates stability. Stability creates the opportunity for investment and prosperity. Okay, so moving on, he talks a little bit more about liberty, and like tying in with what he had talked about there previously is that when he had talked about virtue, he says that in the previous section he had said, England departs from the conformity, rigor, and inquisitiveness of democratic virtue. Far from being a requirement of modern England, virtue is even dangerous to it. What he had meant there, essentially, was that the mixed state allows for self-interest in a way that the pure democracy does not. The pure democracy depends on virtuous people whose interest lies in the benefit of the nation as a whole. A mixed system allows for self-interest because the mixed system itself creates the checks and balances that restrain that self-interest, and therefore there's room for people to be self-interested without bringing the system itself crashing down. So here he says, quote, "The analysis of England must be taken one step further. Its liberty is not only of actions and thoughts, but of passions. To be free is mainly to follow one's appetites for money, prestige, and power. England is capitalistic. The moral limits on endless competitive acquisition have been removed. The parallel in the field of ambition is party politics. England is the modern Athens, a commercial rather than a military or agricultural republic. Aided by its naval power, its imperialism is commercial rather than militaristic. But how does the spirit of commerce keep from destroying itself through excessive luxury and dissoluteness? High taxes keep men working, and frivolous expenditure is considered blameworthy, though whether on religious or business grounds is not clear. Furthermore, the extreme intensity of competition and the constant opening of new economic opportunities makes dissoluteness the exception rather than the rule. Nor can the dissolute still have the influence they had within the narrower confines of the city-state. In sum, avarice and ambition constitute the moral foundations of the English system, not its deadly enemy. Each man's sense of self-interest supports his love of liberty and his patriotism. In England, the liberty of the impassioned many guarantees the liberty of the thoughtful few. Montesquieu does not deny that the vices of Englishmen deserve the bitter satire of a Juvenal, but he himself does not provide that satire. This is because the English system derives benefits for all from the vices it allows and encourages. The utmost in legal security, participation in government by all, and activity in commerce produce a citizen proud of his independence, hopeful of getting ahead, but completely blind to the fact that he is a slave to vulgar passions. England is a secularized society, interested in earthly goods. It does not need a common religion or democratic virtue to bind the community together, and thus can permit more privacy and freedom of expression than ancient Athens itself. With a novel constitutional system by which the striving for selfish interest is given permanent form, England has discovered how to postpone internal breakdown almost indefinitely." End quote. So he's really saying that England is sustained by, oddly, by vice rather than virtue. And this comes, I think, relates in some ways to like the ideas of Adam Smith and capitalism, that each person is enabled to pursue their own self-interest, and that's kind of where he considers vice as opposed to this virtue of devotion to the public good. Each person, through their own greed, through their own desire, their passion, their ambition. They're able to pursue their own interests, and they're set against one another in such a way that that self-interest allows the English system to work. And that sort of self-interest is what allows capitalism to work. And it might seem odd at first, and continues to seem odd, to say that vice itself, selfishness itself, keeps the system working for all parties involved. And that line of argument can, of course, be taken too far, and sometimes is taken too far. But there is a component of truth to it. When each person's desire for prosperity pushes them to, at least in capitalism, pushes them to provide some service to other people, to sell something for other people, to bake the bread, to do the things that they do, the work that they engage in to keep society afloat, because they know they're going to get something for it, and the harder they work or the smarter they work, the more they get. And that sort of self-interest is part of human nature, and rather than attempting to suppress it in the name of virtue, it is, at least, let's say, encouraged or even just allowed. But at any rate, it manifests itself in the society in such a way that the various people's self-interest keeps other people's self-interest in check. But of course, such thing can only be taken so far, like I said. Anyway, that's the basics of Montesquieu, and you can see that some amount of, I think, the American system is, or the American political system is based on the writings of Montesquieu. I'm fairly certain that the founding fathers, at least Jefferson, and I think many of the founding fathers were fans of Montesquieu, readers of Montesquieu, and I do think that his writings went into the formation of the United States Constitution. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.